take two case studies from the broader ASEAN region, Myanmar and East Timor or Timor-Leste, to sort of shed some light on transitional justice and rather what lack of transitional justice can do, the negative processes that it can spur. I'm mostly going to talk about Myanmar because that's my research area, and briefly about East Timor. So this is something that Sanjay already shed some light on, that Myanmar went through a very long period of civil war, and not just civil war but also authoritarian and rather totalitarian rule. More than 70 years of civil conflict, almost close to 70 years of civil conflict, and almost 60 years of authoritarian rule. Now that's a very long time. It's long enough to sort of spur very toxic processes of violence, not just physical violence but also structural violence. And not just violence but also a very deep-seated culture of impunity, especially given the very secretive and closed-up nature of the erstwhile military junta. Now what is sort of important and relevant to our discussion is the continuing of that culture of impunity into a so-called transitioning Myanmar. Now in the past half a decade, we have seen that Myanmar is undergoing a democratic transition which has received widespread global attention. But what we have realized in the past 2 years, specifically, or 2 to 3 years, is that this transition has been largely nominal in nature. It's very top-down in nature. It doesn't take into account a host of factors or the long period of trauma that Myanmar went through because of the violence and the civil conflict. The other point here to note here is that the civil conflict hasn't really ended. The violence in the north has very much flared up. Again, here this is something that I'd like to make a disclosure on. When I'll be talking about peace and reconciliation in Myanmar, I'll mostly be talking about the ethnic civil conflict and not the Rohingya conflict. Because the Rohingya conflict is fairly recent and it has an entirely different a set of dynamics when it comes to justice and reconciliation. Now this is something I would like to borrow from what Sanjay said, use the term which is infection of impunity. It very much characterizes today's Myanmar. Despite the transition, it's important to note that the military or the Tatmadaw in Myanmar very much holds sway over the politics of the country. Not just sort of normative structural sway, but also in terms of real parliamentary numbers. They hold 25% seat share in the union parliament and all state parliaments. Now this is crucial because it imposes sort of a top-down culture of silence and sort of a preservation of the military and the culture of violence that the military has perpetuated for the last 60 years or so. What again Sanjay spoke about, truth-seeking and truth-telling. In Myanmar, leave aside truth-telling. It's a long shot, as in many other places in the world, including in Manipur. Even truth-seeking hasn't permeated the public discourse or the public culture. There are not enough organizations who are even making the attempt to document, systematically document the past abuses. This is despite the fact this culture of impunity exists, despite the fact that the ruling party, which is the National League of Democracy, led by the Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi, is mostly comprised of former political prisoners and pro-democracy activists who had opposed the military junta, the authoritarian rule, despite the outrightly ruthless nature of the rule. Now, despite the presence of former prisoners, political prisoners, and people who have suffered under the military, the culture of impunity exists. Now, there's a very fascinating and rather, I would say, unfortunate psychological, rather institutional thinking that is driving this culture of impunity in Myanmar, which is Aung San Suu Kyi's persistence on the fact that Myanmar should forget the past and move ahead. I think this is a common element in most transitioning societies or post-conflict societies, especially coming from the top-level elite. That the people who fought for democracy in Myanmar must forget the abuses they have faced, must forget the violence that they have faced, and take it as a sacrifice for the nation. Now, while this is a very, looks like a very lionizing and glorifying idea, positive idea of sacrifice, but such a culture of forgetting can spur deeper process of trauma and reverse the process of healing, right? Because there are many political prisoners whose families were tortured and murdered and their close ones were murdered, and now they're being asked to forget the past. Now this is a very toxic sort of recipe for instability in the future, or rather implosion of the political future or political system from the inside. The other thing that this is a theme that has been discussed already in discussions, that when we talk about transitional justice, we definitely need to move out of formal structures of peace and reconciliation, because when it comes to healing, community level healing, I think across the world we have seen, including the South African Truth Commission, that institutionalized formal structures rarely help. The initiative should always come from the bottom up. In Myanmar's case, the example is again antithetical, which is the peace process that is going on right now is heavily formalized. The peace process bureaucracy is very institutionalized, and there is very little space for tier 2, 3, 4 actors to exercise their agency in the peace process. The term transitional justice is not even part of the peace process at the moment. The last time anyone in Myanmar even mentioned the term transitional justice, and the last time when it got attention was back in 2012, when the UN Special Envoy came and expressly urged the United Nations to set up, in collaboration with the Myanmar government, to set up TRC. But obviously that never happened. That was literally the last time any senior figure inside Myanmar, any external or internal figure, mentioned the term truth-telling and truth and reconciliation. The other point that I want to drive here is that in a country like Myanmar, where the military still holds so much sway over the public discourse, that you can be jailed even for, I'm giving you a real life example, you can be jailed even for broadcasting a play which is criticizing the military on your Facebook feed. In such a country where the military still is so sensitive of criticism from civil society quarters, truth-telling can be a very political and very sensitive agenda. Something that even mainstream civilian political actors and civil society actors are not willing to pursue because of the risks involved. The cost of pursuing truth-telling in Myanmar is so high that there is rather a sort of deliberate delaying of the agenda, or the idea that Myanmar is not ready for truth-telling. The peculiar feature of Myanmar's conflict is the multiplicity of actors, armed actors, which is very similar in many ways to the northeast of India. Now this multiplicity of actors, what it does, it complicates the process of reconciliation, because what we are talking about here is a disparate set of ethnic minorities who have not just fought the Myanmar military, but also fought amongst themselves through their ethnic armed organizations. This is something that definitely requires ground-up reconciliation, simply because of the inherent nature of Myanmar's ethnic politics, which is the opposition, the tension between the Bamar-dominated military's unionizing agenda and the ethnic minorities' agenda to gain political autonomy in their own states. Now, because of this tension, any unionized official structure cannot be sustainable. Structure of peace and reconciliation cannot be successful in Myanmar. The last 3 years have definitely proved that. The peace process, as we see today, started in October 2015 with the signing of the nationwide ceasefire agreement. Began much earlier in 2011, but properly began in 2015. So far, we have had a couple of peace conferences, a few ceasefire deals, and that's all. There is absolutely no discussion on leave apart the fact that military leaders should come to the public front and confess to the wrongdoings of the past. There is no discussion on any sort of pursuit of truth or sort of reconciliatory justice in this case. The other point that I wanted to drag across is that in a country which is transitioning and has an active peace process, the tendency is always to measure peace by the number of ceasefire agreements signed, which is the visible violence, right? In such a structure, there is very little agency for deconstructing the idea of peace down to the community level, right? What this has done is this has festered anger amongst especially peripheral minority communities. And this is having a direct counterproductive sort of impact on the peace process itself. I think it was 2 years ago, and this is not just on the government, the onus is not just on the government, the onus is also on the various ethnic armed organizations who claim to represent who represent the ethnic quarters, that even they are unwilling to confront the past abuses. It was, I think, 2 years back that the Karen National Union, which has an armed component called the Karen National Liberation Army, outrightly dismissed the idea of a truth-telling commission. And quote unquote, the commander-in-chief said that Myanmar is not ready for truth-telling yet. So we see that it's not just the perpetrators who have internalized the idea that they can get away with the past abuses, but it's also the ones who have faced the violence, who have internalized the idea that it's pointless to ask for the truth. Rather, it's not just pointless, it's counterproductive to ask for the truth. That if we ask for the truth, the idea is that the political reform process will go back. So the sensitivity attached to that issue has sort of stopped Myanmar from initiating any kind of discussions on this issue. Now I'll sort of quickly shed some light on the East Timor, or what is now known as Timor-Leste issue. Although it's not a part of ASEAN, it's part of the broader Southeast Asian region and it's an observer country in ASEAN. The Timor-Leste issue is very interesting because on the outset, the transitional justice framework I will refer to it as East Timor because it was what that was then. The transitional justice framework in East Timor was successful from the outside. The UN set up a commission, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There was an ad hoc court set up in Jakarta, and there were 2-3 other mechanisms. However, there's some very interesting literature that's come up in the last 5 to 6 years, which says that the success that's been gleaned over East Timor is only superficial. Internalized structures of trauma and healing have not been addressed yet. What is interesting in East Timor's case is how the communities in East Timor, right from the village level to the district level to the state level, started forming their own processes of reconciliation from the ground up, outside of the formal processes. There is also some competing literature that the outside external processes did help, solidify the culture of impunity, which might be true. However, Timor-Leste case singularly shows that institutionalized, formalized structures or transnational structures of justice may not always be successful in facilitating society or country to come out of a long period of intense conflict. In Myanmar's case, we have seen some effort from the international community to bring the perpetrators to justice, but there are many technical restraints that prevent them. For example, Myanmar is not a part of the Rome Statute and hence it cannot be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. Right now, the International Criminal Court within the Rohingya conflict is trying to adjudicate on Myanmar through Bangladesh, exercising extended jurisdiction. However, Myanmar has flatly dismissed all UN reports and all requests from the ICC and the UNHRC to cooperate. So what we see here is a very closed up case, or rather a very pessimistic case, where in the next 1 or 2 decades, even the idea of truth and reconciliation will remain a long shot for the key political actors. I think I would sort of want to end on one particular point which I found very interesting, and this is a point that has come up from the new civil society stakeholders in Myanmar, which is very interesting. For example, the Kachin Peace Support Network and the Karen Peace Support Network, the Shan Women's Peace Support Network. And these are some of the new civil society organizations that are gaining traction in Myanmar, which is a very positive development and gives hope for the future. Now, many of these stakeholders have constantly complained about what I mentioned earlier, which is Aung San Suu Kyi's insistence that Myanmar should forget the past. This is something a lot of them cannot reconcile with. And this is something which only aggravates the anger of how the anger at a very ground level. So I think political elites, we had a discussion about what role the government can play. Of course, institutions and courts and judicial mechanisms can play a very important role. And of course, the large-scale consensus is that civil society mobilization plays a crucial role. But the point that I want to drive across with reference to Myanmar and probably all other domains is that the political elite, how the political elite remembers the abuses and the traumas, can also have a powerful trickle-down effect on how the society approaches the idea of truth and reconciliation. And hence, I think there should be a push from the outside, especially the civil society, for the leaders, for the political leaders to come to the public discourse, to come to the public and sort of entrench the idea that healing is important, that collective psychological healing is important, and there is no need to forget the past. In fact, we have to reconcile with the past rather than forget it. Thank you.